Hi, welcome in everyone. So let's get started. We already have our presenter, as I said, Jenna Battinson. She works on how to minimize or lower the outdoor water use without significant impact to ecological habitat. And with that, Jenna, it's all yours.
All righty. Well, thank you so much. Can you see that screen?
Yes, we can see
Perfect.
the slides.
Great. The hard part is over now. Thank you so much for that introduction. Again, my name is Jenna Batson. I'm the Outdoor Water Conservation Coordinator with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. I run the state's turf replacement grant program, and I've been leading the advancement of some landscape change initiatives in the water supply planning section of CWCB. I am very honored to be asked to share some recent efforts from CWCB just surrounding all things landscape transformation. So thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your interest in this topic. So just before diving into the State of the Science report, which is the focus of this presentation, I just want to provide some background on what the Colorado Water Conservation Board, or CWCB, does. So we are a non-regulatory water policy state government agency that is housed within the Department of Natural Resources. Our mission is to conserve, develop, protect, and manage Colorado's water for present and future generations. We are Colorado's most comprehensive water information resource, and we provide a broad range of programs and technical assistance, as well as financial assistance through grant programs and our loan program, just to support local and state water conservation initiatives and efforts and help build resiliency in the state around everything water. So the Colorado Water Plan is the state's guiding water policy document. The CWCB adopted the current Colorado Water Plan in January of 2023, and it really serves as this framework for this statewide collaboration around water planning. And so the water plan helps to guide future decision-making and supports these local actions to address water challenges with this really collaborative and balanced and solution-oriented approach that can help build resilience. The water plan includes 4 main focus areas that work together to help build a stronger state. There's certainly overlaps between all of them, but there's vibrant communities, there's robust agriculture, there's thriving watersheds, and there's resilient planning. So the work of landscape transformation as a means to reduce outdoor municipal water use is part of the vibrant communities focus, and the water plan provides this direction on supporting these efforts, which is the origin of the report that I am presenting today. The water plan includes 50 agency actions across the 4 main focus areas that I mentioned. Agency Action 1.7 of the water plan tasks CWCB with identifying turf replacement options that align with Colorado's climate and can reduce outdoor municipal water use. So this effort includes researching and supporting best practices for turf replacement, exploring alternative methods to promote change, and addressing just fundamental irrigation issues to help shift Colorado's landscapes towards reduced water use, but also maintaining these resilient and livable and really aesthetically appealing and pleasing landscapes. So this is the context, the inspiration, the charge for the State of the Science report. So this Action 1.7 defines transformative landscape change as a concept that promotes using less water-intensive plants and incorporates high-efficiency irrigation methods to maintain these, again, vibrant landscapes in our communities. The goal of transformative landscape change is not to eliminate green spaces. They provide value, and they might need supplemental irrigation. So we're not, risking all of our landscapes in just the pursuit of saving water. So it's really just more around, increasing our irrigation efficiency for desired vegetation and to shift vegetation with maybe decreased watering requirements in places where it's appropriate and it can also be sustained. So I won't be specifically speaking about these related initiatives today, but I do want to just mention that in 2023, Colorado Governor Polis initiative charged CWCB with convening and leading a 21-member task force, which brought together thought leaders from different sectors across Colorado just to explore landscape change. And this effort culminated in a final report that included consensus recommendations, as well as areas that maybe needed more research. That came out in January 2024. So these recommendations and these areas to explore really helped to guide the State of the Science report. And then CWCB also recently collaborated on a now available do-it-yourself DIY guide for residential landscape transformation, which is a public and free resource and part of this big umbrella 1.7 action in the water plan. And I'll provide a link at the end of this presentation so you have access to those resources, which are all on a single landing page. So the state of the science report, informed by many, many components, and I just want to highlight some of them. First, as I mentioned, the Urban Landscape Conservation Task Force, those recommendations, those elevated areas for research, provided that initial direction for CWCB staff to start to dive in deeper into this subject matter. We also collaborated with and contracted with subject matter experts to just further look into some of these topics and help shape and inform the report. We worked with 7 different contractors listed here just to develop these companion reports that are standalone documents, but they're also cited and referenced and incorporated throughout the report. The analysis also incorporates preliminary data and lessons learned from the State Turf Replacement Grant Program, which was created in 2022 legislation, launched in January 2023, and then received additional funding in 2024. So we, looked at the best available data to help develop these initial takeaways from the program, but that data, of course, might fluctuate because, as I said, it launched in January 2023, so a lot is still going on. So that information will still be coming in as those projects and the programs start to evolve and take more shape. When scoping and crafting the report, we also returned to the recordings of the CWCB board meetings since the launch of the TURF program in January 2023. So this report was also an avenue to address those questions and points that our board had raised, which allowed us to provide more context to help answer those questions, sort of this helpful test to be like, does what we're saying make sense? What questions do you have? What else can we bring into this report? We also participated in discussions, learned from expert presentations, engaged in countless stakeholder meetings just to better understand all the complex aspects of landscape transformation. We did a ton of research, a lot of analyzing what was out there. Definitely incorporated lessons learned from work in Colorado, but also from other states, just because what other people are doing, we might not be able to completely, copy paste, but it is really helpful for us to learn what's going on elsewhere so that we can apply those lessons learned into the work that we're doing. So this report was led by CWCB staff, and it was not just us. It was really developed through this intentional and collaborative and, just a lot of communication. We've actively sought and responded to feedback just to ensure that this analysis is really balanced and acknowledges a lot of diverse perspectives and the idea that because this is so complicated and there's so many different parts, a lot of things can be true at the same time, which is okay, right? It's just, we want to get all that out there and be able to talk about it. So the report starts with some state context, just showing that we have done in the last few years. This includes a graphic showing the different initiatives, including a 2022 landscape summit, the water plan grants that are helping to advance related topics, the turf replacement grant program, and then some exploratory analysis on the economics of turf replacement. The report also opens with a longer history of landscape change in Colorado, including the fact that the term xeriscape was coined in Colorado by a team of experts at Denver Water in the early 1980s. So this concept, all this work is not new in Colorado by any means, but there has been this really strong resurgence in the last few years in this prioritization, which is why I think we're hearing about it a lot more. The context also includes the report principles, which include an emphasis on, responsible planning and community resilience, prioritizing really cost-effective water conservation strategies that can maximize the water savings and the ecosystem benefits while minimizing the cost where possible. It also, is talking about considering a range of factors and understanding the risks when we're taking on large-scale change to anything. The priorities also state that communities need outdoor water. That doesn't mean that there isn't room for improved efficiency, but water is necessary for these vibrant communities. And then finally, that this progress can be incremental. Slow work doesn't necessarily mean it's bad work, right? It's still important. So it's just bringing all these principles together just as kind of a guiding framework. This report is not meant to be the absolute final word on these topics, but instead is really just meant to capture the best available data that we have now and present what we know. I keep joking that as soon as this report was published, it's already outdated because we are constantly learning so much, and new data, new studies, they become available all the time, which is amazing. So this report is exactly as it's titled. It's just the state of the science right now in Colorado. Things can change, things are changing, and we just continue to learn, which is really exciting with all the work that's still going on. So after the background, after the context, the principles, the report is divided into 9 main sections, and each section provides preliminary context and some key takeaways. That's kind of designed for, more of the casual reader that wants to look at the report and be like, okay, what do I need to get from this? Great, I'm done. So people can, kind of read it as they will. And all of these sections really vary in length, but they represent components of interest under each of the big umbrella topics. The sections, again, were built on these conversations that we've had with a lot of experts and stakeholders, because anytime we talk about landscape change and landscapes, there seems to be well, what about this? What about including this in the conversation? So as a result, this report is very robust. It's very far reaching. The scope definitely kept creeping, which I think is, okay, and rightfully so. So we just continue to dive in deeper and further into all of these topics as these conversations continue to develop. I am not going to go into every detail of each section because this report is a design 72 pages. So I do want to provide some highlights from all 9 sections just to help convey the way Colorado is thinking about these topics and how interrelated all the components of landscape change truly are. So the first section is all about systems thinking, and it sets the stage for, why we are exploring so many interrelated topics. Despite CWCB's very water-centric mission, we approach this report broadly, as I've said, to think holistically about the impacts of landscape change that extend beyond just water savings and demand reductions. We assess potential positive and negative impacts as interconnected and part of this wider dynamic system. So this analysis recognizes that while CWCB is rightfully interested in reducing water demand, it's just not the sole factor to consider. And because of this, it really opens the door for broadening this coalition of entities and groups to really help responsibly advance, support, even help fund community landscape transformation efforts. So in other words, these efforts are not solely about water use reduction. So these initiatives cannot reasonably be advanced solely by entities working in water. It's going to take a broader group to achieve this, vision of this resilient and appropriate landscapes across Colorado. This section pulls in references and links a contracted report with Wright Water Engineers to provide just more insight into the potential impacts of widespread landscape transformation. So this contracted report, which is also available on its own, looks at this really broad range of topics regarding the impact of turf removal and replacement, including water quality, runoff characteristics, urban heat island, pollinators, and carbon sequestration. So this report, the Wright Water Engineers report, really provides us valuable information for the discussion and can be this starting point for further studies on topics that are all interrelated and impact these efforts. So the next section is really looking at collaborative land use planning. There's certainly a critical connection between urban development, land use planning, green spaces, and water conservation. And this report advocates for balancing that urban development with preserving and even enhancing regionally appropriate green spaces, because as I've said, living landscapes are really vital to these thriving communities, and they provide these extra benefits like the cooling environment, the urban heat mitigation, pollinator habitats, stormwater management. So local governments have this really important role that can help guide developers and residents towards these more sustainable choices just by incorporating water efficient landscape principles into their codes and rules. So these landscape or land use codes are really powerful and relatively cost-effective tools for local governments and just to guide the sustainable development. And these codes can shape urban landscapes, right? They can encourage water-wise practices. They can make people start thinking about, why should I be thinking about how I'm using my outdoor water? And this report provides these examples of what this can look like in Colorado. So first, the Colorado General Assembly passed SB 24005 last year, which requires local land use authorities to update their local codes by January 1st, 2026, so next year, to prohibit the installation of non-functional turf, artificial turf, or invasive plant species on commercial, institutional, or industrial properties, as well as common interest community properties, also street right-of-ways, parking lots, mediums, transportation corridors. So local authorities can, of course, go further than what is called for, but the legislation just really sets that minimum that they'll need to adhere to by the first of next year. Also through Executive Order D 2023-18, Colorado's Governor Polis also called for the creation of a water-wise landscape policy for state facilities, which went into effect in the summer of 2024. So this section is really just looking at, how are we developing? Are we developing in a way that is going to be sustainable, and thinking about how that is a contributing factor for just us being able to build our resilience through landscapes that can require less supplemental irrigation. So the next section, all about balancing ecosystem cost and benefits. The broader water plan and also Agency Action 1.7 incorporates climate change into the conversation, and the report brings in considerations from the 2023 Climate Change in Colorado report, which was a collaboration between CWCB and the Colorado Climate Center. So, this is saying further and significant warming is expected in all parts of Colorado in all seasons over the next several decades. Future warming will lead to declines in summer soil moisture throughout the state, and additional future warming will drive greater evaporative demand. So climate change will continue to impact precipitation, soil moisture, and the amount of irrigation that landscapes need. And you can call climate change whatever you want, just don't call it predictable. We can certainly model what the future will look like through these scenarios, which are very, very helpful. But because of these inherent uncertainties, we should consider landscape transformation efforts in terms of this really long-term resilience building. And this report really underscores that importance of thinking in the long term and considering, what our communities can look like in the future, what they should look like, what they'll be able to look like, right? So like what vegetation can be supported, how can we start planting, planning, installing, and maintaining these types of landscapes when water is available for their establishment. So that report and then the context of that set up this section's analysis on the impacts of outside of just water savings. So these efforts, of course, with turf replacement and landscape transformation are designed to reduce outdoor municipal water demand. CWCB also wants to avoid creating unnecessary and even adverse environmental and health impacts. So this report very intentionally conveys that living landscapes are vital to thriving communities and provide these additional environmental benefits, that I've mentioned: the cooling capabilities, the mitigating effects of urban heat, healthy tree canopies, providing pollinator habitats, creating these stormwater management, including runoff reduction and water infiltration. So non or minimally vegetated landscapes can most certainly reduce water use, but those areas will not necessarily serve soil health, pollinator habitats, all of the other benefits that I just talked about. What we put in the ground absolutely matters. How we maintain it absolutely matters. And this report makes that very, very clear. The report looks at the cooling capabilities in different landscapes and draws on lessons from a recent Desert Research Institute report that shows that xeriscape landscapes in their study were 3 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than other landscapes with more water intensive vegetation. This research is not Colorado specific, but it does offer some insight just into the impact that plants and landscapes have on outdoor temperature and the importance of just maintaining landscapes that are capable of cooling their surroundings. In 2024, the CWCB awarded a water plan grant to help fund research at the University of Colorado Boulder, with an emphasis on really exploring the effects of landscape transformations on urban heat and also water quality. And we really look forward to learning more of that initiative, and goes back to me saying, when this report's published, it's already outdated because just so much cool stuff is going on right now. We also talked to the Colorado State Forest Service, who provided excellent input, very helpful, very wise input into this section about the importance of urban tree canopy and the impact on tree health through landscape change. And, the focus of a lot of these conversations is typically on grass or turf and, whether it's functional or not functional, but considerations really need to be made for our urban trees. We incorporate lessons from other states into this report, which includes a case study in Sacramento showing that mandatory watering restrictions resulted in the damage or death of around 20% of their tree canopy. And also another case study about how extreme heat is limiting the number and the variety of tree species that can continue to thrive in the Las Vegas area. So again, we really wanted to incorporate these lessons from other states that can help Colorado avoid the same outcomes, the same undesirable outcomes. We're all doing this parallel work, and it's just important to share what we've learned so that we can help advance together. Because we all sort of have the same long-term goals, although there's obviously regional nuance, but it's really helpful to learn what's going on in these other areas. This report also recognizes that accessible green spaces are not equally distributed across Colorado, which may mean increasing irrigation in some areas is necessary just to help spread the green, which is essentially just spreading the ecosystem services of these living landscapes. This image on the slide is produced by Groundwork, which is an environmental nonprofit. They used tree cover maps overlaid with historic redline areas to show the lasting impact of discrimination on green spaces in cities. And while outside of the charge of the CWCB that is very water centric, these factors are all inherently wrapped up in landscape change. And we want to just be really careful about how we're changing our landscapes, so that we can help correct some issues from the past and don't create new problems for the future. So the next section is all about understanding the metrics. We strive to be very transparent, very straightforward about the water saving impacts. The amount of irrigation applied to a landscape is the absolute maximum that can be saved from the landscape conversion. You can't save more than what was previously applied. So this we've seen as the issue with sometimes presenting these projects with percentages that are often estimates of the savings from a conversion project can produce, because percentages aren't telling the whole story. And this graphic is meant to show that. So hypothetically, if we were to say, 40% savings are achievable, that 40% looks really, really different if a landscape was previously receiving 70 gallons per square feet or 16 gallons per square feet. So with that 40% reduction, that landscape receiving 70 is going to be, used by 28 gallons per square feet. The landing receiving 16 is going to reduce its use by 6.4. So the result of a 40% reduction is quite different, but the detail isn't always conveyed when talking about the impact in terms of percentages. We really need to be transparent and consistent and realistic in how we talk about these water savings, because it helps with planning. It helps with understanding, how much of this do we need to change? What is the impact on the future? In the report, where appropriate, we also call for any water use reductions from programs or projects to be shared in acre feet rather than gallons, so the efforts are more readily comparable. Of course, when you're dealing with 70 gallons per square feet or 16 gallons per square feet, you're not going to convert that to acre feet because there's a lot of zeros in there and it's just not helpful. But that conversion is it is helpful with the overall impact, because you want to, when you're comparing different projects and the value that they produce as far as water savings, it's just helpful for that comparison with opportunity cost and looking at different conservation and demand reduction tools. Metrics really speak volumes, and they need to be consistent so that we can empower ourselves to make better decisions when we're looking at comparing apples to apples. This is also because if you aren't really well versed in water volume metrics, hearing 1 million gallons saved sounds really, really big, because a million of anything sounds really big, but that equates to just over 3 acre feet. That isn't nothing, right? All water savings are important, but we just want to ensure that we're helping to level set expectations rather than inflate them by how we communicate the impact in Colorado. We also talk quite a bit about tracking the irrigation changes over time, because it's just so important. The reality is the impact of these efforts on water consumption, they may take several years to analyze as data is collected, as landscapes are established, as things change, right? If you have a really, really rainy spring and you don't need as much water, it can look like, oh, that was a ton of water savings from this landscape change, but it was just, the natural precipitation meant that these plants needed less supplemental irrigation. We do have some preliminary data that we are working with from the Turf Replacement Grant Program, But the short answer on water savings in Colorado is it still depends, right? We're still looking at these numbers. We're still waiting for information to come in. So monitoring and tracking are, how we know if these water savings are occurring. And if you're not tracking your water use on the new landscapes, you don't really know if it's being irrigated to the level that it should be to achieve the savings that you're expected. We also, of course, need to understand the baseline irrigation application before conversion, just to understand the difference after conversion and after that landscape is established. So monitoring and tracking are essential to understand the impact of these efforts and ensure these savings are being maintained. And we talk about that quite a bit in this report throughout many of the sections. And the next section, we also talk about non-functional or inefficient irrigation, as a lot of this conversation has recently shifted to focusing on the vegetation to reduce water use and not the irrigation application itself. So a non-functional irrigation system is inefficient, it applies more water than is needed, and the root of water savings through landscape transformation is, it's not necessarily the vegetation itself, but it's reducing that irrigation application. So for example, if there's an entire field of Kentucky bluegrass that is replaced with these lower water use vegetation types, that change in water use isn't going to change unless the irrigation isn't adjusted or maintained and just kept at the level that the plant is supposed to receive. So transforming landscapes really involves more than just replacing plants. It requires upkeep, observation to ensure efficient water use. This applies to all landscapes, not just with those with lower water use that are being replaced. It's all the landscapes that we really need to keep an eye on the efficiency of the irrigation system. We can become efficient everywhere outdoors, and we really emphasize that in the report, and the importance of just actionable irrigation audits and illustrate how to improve water efficiency regardless of that landscape type. So these photos are all examples of non-functional irrigation. I'm sure we've all seen these out in our communities. If not, apologies, because you probably will now, because once you start noticing them, you see it everywhere. So this one on the top left is just a really excellent example of non-functional irrigation, because that system is watering, rock, and it's watering hardscape, places that irrigation is not intended to go. I'm not sure if there was vegetation under that tree before, but regardless, there's a more functional, more efficient way to ensure that water is being delivered to the tree roots where it needs to go. So all of these other photos, these are taken by CWCB staff just walking around their neighborhoods and snapping photos. This bottom one on the right is a really prime example of why irrigation efficiency and monitoring are so vital for these efforts. This is a water-wise garden, but because of that non-functional irrigation system that's sending water into the street, the water use is still not efficient. So a plant alone doesn't determine if it's water-wise, it's how much water is being delivered and then how much water is being delivered around it. So adjusting the irrigation rate just to meet the lowering water requirements of a plant is fundamental to reducing water use. Outdoor irrigation systems, unlike indoor fixtures, they're exposed to the elements, they can easily malfunction, become non-functional, and become inefficient. These issues can, of course, go unnoticed because people's relationships with their indoor and outdoor water use are vastly different. For example, if your shower head is spraying like any one of these irrigation systems, you address it because you see it, it impacts your life, it's an inconvenience, you fix that as quickly as possible. This isn't always the case with outdoor water use, which can lead to that inefficient use of the resource. Reducing municipal irrigation demand is not a single-step solution that produces these permanent results. Monitoring water use reductions is just, again, really crucial because we can't serve what we don't track, we can't conserve what we don't measure, and we can't address these inefficiencies if we aren't looking for them. So the next section is all about managing expectations. This is the longest section because, well, there's a lot of expectations to manage when it comes to landscape transformation. There are a lot of nuances, there's a lot of complexities, and we just wanted to be really clear about how we're thinking about the impact from these efforts. And I've touched on this a little bit, but we want to be straightforward and very honest about the impacts of turf replacement from a water savings, but also a cost perspective, because there are a lot of initiatives, there's a lot of tools that need funding. So you need to really weigh the outcomes and, the impact of all of them to get a clearer vision of how you should move forward with water efficiency or water conservation plans. So CWCB contracted with BBC Research and Consulting For a previous exploratory economic turf analysis that was based on the best available data at that time, which showed that the technical maximum potential water savings that would result from removing 30% of non-functional turf in Colorado to be about 20,000 acre-feet annually. This, of course, can come with a price tag of up to $2.5 billion. That cost is based on a range of DIY costs, so that can also vary. This number, this cost does not mean that Colorado will achieve this number. It's just showing what is potentially possible. This number will likely be closer to a max cost-effective amount, and that precise volume is, of course, unknown. But just when analyzing the return on investment from these efforts, it's complicated and nuanced. So when you hear that $2.5 billion price tag, you're like, wait, what? But a lot of things go into this, and there's a lot of conversation behind it. And the cost of turf conversion can vary. Some benefits are also more qualitative and difficult to quantify, including a conservation program's impact on the community mindset. So programs like the Turf Replacement Grant Program, can produce these positive externalities through community awareness and engagement, helping to establish and grow a conservation ethic and landscape replacement adoption without state or local funding. So turf replacement efforts they're a visible representation of water conservation and something that people can understand. And that's really difficult to get into a cost-benefit analysis. These additional non-market benefits impact that return on investment, certainly. And then the thinking behind funding landscape transformation programs. So we present in the report the concept of the neighbor effect, which results from a landscape type becoming increasingly adopted as communities and community norms start to shift, and people are seeing more visual representations of what their landscapes can look like. So this concept can lead to passive savings, which essentially means achievable savings that do not require state or local investment. A Planetscape AI study shows the neighbor effect of the Metropolitan Water District in Southern California and their turf replacement program, where 132 additional converted properties in their service area occurred for every 100 rebate recipients. So quite a big multiplier effect there. And we don't at this time have similar studies in Colorado, but this is a really promising finding that the status quo can start to shift over time as more of these properties adopt and display these water-wise landscaping. It can start to sort of shift the market and the desires of how people maintain their landscapes. So we show that conservation efforts become more effective over time based on the turf replacement grant program applications that our CWCB board reviewed at our January 2025 board meeting. So this table is in the report, and it shows the cost per acre foot if the savings continue to accrue annually. I want to note that, there's a few outliers in here. Applicant A on this chart is one of those outliers because that represents an income-based program that covers the entire cost of turf replacement, as well as the programmatic components without additional input from the benefiting property. So this, of course, will mean that the cost per acre foot is higher than other programs. The reality is that the price of turf conversion varies, and it's dependent on many factors, including what is included in the cost that's presented. So, for example, a flat rebate amount that doesn't reflect the entire program amount is going to look very differently than a program that is covering start to finish the entire project and the program itself. So, if a grant application shows $2 per square foot as their rebate in their cost in their budget, this is just for the rebate. It doesn't include things like program development, tracking tools, management, any marketing or public outreach efforts, customer support, monitoring assessment, staff time, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just that baseline $2 rebate, not showing anything else. It's also not, accounting for any supplemental costs that a property owner will take on, as the conversion costs typically exceed the rebate program amount. So when you see, this program costs $2 per square foot, just keep in mind that that's only part of the story of what's actually going into that. And also, similar to other water projects, costs are going to inevitably differ and vary based on regional prices for removal and replacement material, labor costs, the extent of irrigation upgrades if they're necessary, how much of the project cost the award recipient is taking on, and all the other components that go into landscape transformation. But back to the chart, when considering the medium cost of $262,500 per acre foot in the table, that cost per acre feet is going to decrease. And the return on this one-time investment will become more favorable over time. So for example, the median cost per acre foot over 5 years becomes $52,500. Over 10 years, that cost becomes $26,250. So the increase of value, if of course the landscape's maintained to receive the lower irrigation amount, it's going to continue to increase. And we thought that we really wanted to show this in this report because typically these cost benefit analyses select a specific time based on the present value of water or the current economic value assigned to a unit of water. And it really undervalues the conservation's potential ongoing benefits. So as the climate warms, water scarcity increases and vegetation requires more irrigation, the value of water would also be expected to increase, which would impact the return on investment from reducing municipal outdoor water use. Of course, even with all that information, for some communities, the upfront cost of all of this might still be prohibitive, but we just wanted to show that there is this frequently overlooked aspect of the conservation benefit cost analysis. And, if we're looking long-term, these investments can become increasingly valuable if maintained when comparable to the changing cost of water. So another part of managing expectations is really knowing, how much water is going to these different outdoor uses. There's so much focus on turf and non-functional turf, so it's really helpful to have a better understanding of, outdoor water use, where it goes. It's helpful for us to do state planning, but also regional conservation planning. So this pie chart, which is also in the report, shows a typical breakdown of a municipal outdoor water use for a single-family residential property. So as you can see, there is a much clearer picture of how indoor water is used, which is reasonable. But when it comes to outdoors, the details are not typically provided. And this can sometimes result in the thought that, 100% of outdoor municipal water use goes to turf, or even 100% of outdoor municipal water use goes to non-functional turf. But that's just not factoring in the water that's used for these other purposes, including things like our trees, our shrubs, our gardens, our pools. Of course, there could be some irrigation use overlap between those, but it's just really not disaggregated. And this can lead to an overflated understanding of just, how much water is used on turf and non-functional turf, and by extension, how much water can be saved from these turf replacement efforts. So a more refined statewide land cover analysis based on land use classifications could really help reveal that there, is a potential to save more or even less water than previous estimates through the replacement of non-functional turf, or even through just improving efficiency on our landscapes. So this type of analysis would also allow for flexibility, as the definition of non-functional turf is dynamic and unique from community to community. But basically understanding the outdoor breakdown would give us a better understanding of where outdoor water is going, what outdoor water is necessary to support thriving communities in Colorado. And of course, by extension of that, again, what can potentially be saved through these efforts. CWCB did a pilot study with PlanetScape AI for this report, which looked at analysis similar to this in Denver County, just to pilot and see, what information does come out of this. So the 2025 CWCB projects bill also includes a section approved by the CWCB board to authorize funding for a statewide land cover and land use analysis, just to provide this information, which we will know more about at the end of the legislative session. But we know that it would be very helpful in statewide and also regional planning if we have this information. So moving on into the next section, we look at a strategy of prioritizing the highest water users to reduce outdoor water use, because again, the more irrigation applied to a landscape, the more potential water savings can occur. So a contracted report that we did with Water DM partially informs a section of this report, and then that information is also incorporated throughout the rest of the report. But this effort with Water DM involved interviewing water providers across the state just to learn more about the highest water users across sectors and communities in Colorado, to help understand where the biggest impact can occur, especially if you have limited funding. Like, is there somewhere that you can target to reduce more water than if you were just kind of doing a scatter shot turf rebate program? This, of course, this analysis concluded with, it depends on the community, which is a reasonable conclusion. There's not always a one-size-fits-all approach, but there was some really interesting insights that came out of this initiative. So many water providers across Colorado have yet to calculate the volume of water that could be saved by targeting and reducing excessive use. However, some entities have identified a usage imbalance amongst their customers. So, for an example, one of the East Slope providers that we interviewed assessed that 15 to 20% of its residential customers over irrigate, and likely 20% do in the commercial sector. So, those might be really prime places for irrigation audits and figuring out, how can we increase efficiency? It doesn't necessarily mean that their vegetation needs to be changed, but just, how can we get them to use less water because they don't need to be using as much as they are. A West Slope provider also showed that the top 10% of its customers were consistently accounting for about 50% of municipal water use. So these communities with these extremely unbalanced water use among properties should, maybe look at prioritizing addressing these highest water users just to really help maximize water savings. There was also a separate contributing report that CWCB contracted with BBC Research and Consulting, showing that thoughtful and practical rate structures, including tiered rate billing that establish higher billing rates for excessive use, can encourage water conservation through pricing signals. And the report shows that conservation-oriented rate structures in Colorado can potentially reduce single-family residential water use by about 20% or 90,000 acre-feet per year, and commercial water use by 8% or 15,000 acre-feet per year. So while rebate programs aren't always designed to target the highest water users, we just wanted to show that there are other ways to move the needle and to think about how to move the needle when it comes to reducing outdoor water use. So the eighth section is all about learning from existing programs. Again, I manage the state's turf replacement grant program, which has over 50 funding recipients across the state. I have been in many conversations all the time about how these programs are going, what lessons are being learned. These funding recipients are water utilities, districts, municipalities, nonprofits working in water. They are not direct to resident. We distribute funding to these eligible entities, and then they are free to set up what type of program works for them, whether or not that's a turf replacement program at the local level or a site-specific project that they've identified as high water use or highly visible or something that will have a big impact on the community. They are welcome to choose the way that they move forward with that. So I have been talking to them for over the past 2 years and just learning so much about what they're learning and what they're conveying, and it has been fascinating to see the overlaps and hear the insights and just watch as they adapt and pivot when necessary. But what we're really learning is that the turf replacement grant program, but also other incentive programs can be really valuable as these visual tools for promoting sustainable landscaping and water rights practices. Widespread landscape change, we've learned, takes time. It requires resources. It requires community buy-in, program adaptability, and capacity for program management. Local programs, especially rebate programs, can be a big lift to set up. It's not something that just happens. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And it's just really crucial to have these realistic expectations going in for water savings, but also just thinking about all these other factors of can we support a program like this at the local level. We've also learned that a program is only as good as it's known. It needs to be marketed to increase the outreach and impact. There needs to be that public engagement and effective monitoring and tracking. That also requires dedicated capacity and resources. But if you're not tracking the savings, then you're not able to evaluate the program and see if it's working and then compare it to other tools that you might have the opportunity to advance. We've learned, adapting programs to local context is essential. They need to be appealing to be successful. Irrigation system upgrades and maintenance are crucial for maximizing water conservation benefits, so those really need to be incorporated into the program or the project itself. And while turf replacement programs can certainly encourage a shift towards a new landscape aesthetic and ethic, their statewide impact can be limited and incremental. Again, that's slow change. It doesn't mean that it's bad change. It just means, we have to be realistic with how long this is going to take. And it's just important to remember that, landscape transformation, constantly reminding it takes time. So keep evaluating the programs, keep moving forward, and future initiatives that really adopt this holistic approach, combining turf replacement with other water conservation strategies, can increase the effectiveness and complement these existing efforts. And this long-term community engagement and support are really paramount for success, and engagement just to start shifting that behavioral change. which is all about the ninth section. So this is the last section, and it's all about shifting the status quo. Everything comes back to behavioral change, and that behavioral change needs to be maintained, which is not, an exceptionally easy task. So especially with something as dynamic as outdoor water use, you have to keep people engaged in this. It can't be, again, a one-off solution like, oh, check that box, we're done. It's something that has to continue on. There is this deeply ingrained, as we all know, American ideal of a green lawn that was established through historical and very intentional cultural influences that can certainly hinder the transition to water-wise landscaping. So to achieve landscape transformation and just to promote sustainable water use, it's essential to challenge these norms where appropriate and just educate the public through, consistent and intentional public engagement. Shifting societal norms and behaviors around landscape and water use is really foundational to creating this impact and increasing this impact. So education and community engagement are key, should be consistent. In this report, we highlight initiatives like Denver Water's Use Only What You Need campaign that really help drive down municipal water use to serve as this example of what robust and far-reaching marketing strategies can look like, right? It's in your face, you're seeing it all the time, so you're reminded, oh, I should think about my outdoor water use. Many people are just simply unaware of their outdoor water use consumption, which leads to waste, justifies the necessity of redefining that connection between the user and the use. So again, this ongoing public education can really foster this water conservation culture and encourage just intentional water use. In some areas, the landscape industry must also shift to support a new low water landscape aesthetic and ensure these landscapes of tomorrow are maintained and properly cared for, just to ensure the resilience and sustainability. And CWCB has awarded 2 water plan grants, one to Western Resource Advocates and one to Colorado Springs Utilities, to really look into this side of things with the landscaping industry to make sure we're all moving together at the same speed and we're not missing any parts of what's going on with this progress. So, these foundational and multifaceted approaches are really the precursor to shifting the status quo, and just really thinking about also these other conservation tools that are around that we can lean on and really to complement all of these efforts. So to conclude, Colorado is certainly in the process of reimagining its landscapes just in response to climate change, water scarcity. We want to be really intentional, really thoughtful, and realistic about these impacts. Transformative landscape change, including turf replacement, can advance water conservation, but the water savings from turf replacement alone can be comparatively modest and might not justify the high upfront costs in some areas. We want to really think, living landscapes are important for ecological benefits and need to be maintained. There's a pathway for increase in efficiency across all landscapes. These initiatives really need to be supported. They're not going to happen overnight. It's just continuous change. And this multi-pronged approach that includes efficient irrigation, behavioral change, community engagement. It's all necessary to maximize water savings and achieve the sustainable landscape for future generations. So these programs, all these efforts, all these initiatives that everyone's doing, just such amazing work has been going on in Colorado, but it helps residents and our communities embrace this more sustainable and water-wise actions and behaviors. And, we're going to continue to monitor the impact of statewide programs as more data becomes available, and super excited about all the initiatives that are still going on. So with that, here's a quick response code if you want to check out the landing page with all of these efforts. My email is on here. Please reach out. Please feel free. If you ever have research or initiatives or something you're excited about that's related to this, please send it. That's how I learn. That's how we all learn. I love to see all of that. So thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for having me. This has been fun. And again, if there are questions that we don't have time to answer, I can always follow up.
Okay, that's all for today then. Thank you so much. And Ben, thanks as always.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Thank you all so much. This has been fun. Appreciate having me.